It was a time of shadows. New York City, 1929. The stock market had just crashed, but for some men, business was booming. Prohibition was the law of the land, you see, and that meant money, rivers of it, flowing into the pockets of men who weren't afraid to break the rules. These men, they came from the old country, Sicily. They brought their traditions with them, their codes of honor, and their feuds. Two worlds were about to collide. The old ways versus the new. This wasn't just a street fight. This was a war for the soul of the American Mafia. It was the Castellammarese War. And when the smoke cleared, nothing would ever be the same again. You have to understand the tension. It was thick. You could cut it with a knife. On one side you had the old guard, the mustache Petes. Men who came from Sicily, from a town called Castellammarese del Golfo. They believed in the old ways, secrecy, respect, mustaches. They looked down on the younger guys, the Americanized ones. They saw them as reckless, disrespectful of tradition. They thought they could control everything, just like they did back home. But America wasn't Sicily. The rules were different here. The opportunities were bigger, and the stakes were much, much higher. This was a new world, and it demanded a new kind of thinking. On the other side, you had the young guns, the young Turks. Guys like me, guys like Lucky Luciano. They grew up on the streets of New York. They saw the bigger picture. They didn't care if you were Sicilian or Neapolitan or Jewish. If you could make money, you were in. They saw the mustache Petes as dinosaurs, relics of a bygone era. Their obsession with old-world feuds and silly rituals was holding everyone back. Luciano and his crew, they wanted to run things like a business, an American business, a corporation of crime. They were hungry, they were ambitious, and they were tired of waiting for the old men to die. So you have these two forces, oil and water, an immovable object and an unstoppable force. Joe the Boss Masseria, the big man in Manhattan, he represented the Neapolitan side, but he was the established power. He wanted it all. Then there was Salvatore Maranzano, the Castellammarese challenger, a man who thought he was Julius Caesar reborn. He wanted to be the boss of all bosses. The tension built slowly, a dirty look here, an insult there, a hijacked liquor truck, small things, but they added up. It was a powder keg, and the whole city was waiting for someone to light the fuse. The war was coming, everyone knew it, it was just a matter of when. Salvatore Maranzano. That was the name on everyone's lips. He was the man from Castellammarese del Golfo. He arrived in New York with a reputation. He was educated, he spoke Latin, he studied Roman history, he saw himself as a strategist, a general, a new Caesar for a new Rome. He wasn't just a thug, he was a man with a vision of a mafia structured like the Roman legions, a strict hierarchy, absolute loyalty. He despised the younger Americanized gangsters. He called them disrespectful. He believed they lacked honor. To him, the mafia was a sacred Sicilian thing. It wasn't for outsiders, it wasn't for business partners, it was for blood. Maranzano wasn't alone, of course. He had his soldiers, his believers. The Castellammarese clan was powerful. They had guys like Joseph Bonanno, who was young but an old soul. He was loyal to Maranzano. He believed in the traditions. Then there was Stefano Magaddino up in Buffalo, a powerful boss. He controlled the flow of liquor from Canada. He threw his weight, his money, and his guns behind Maranzano. They were the old world, the mustache Petes. They believed in long-standing feuds and settling scores the Sicilian way. They saw Joe Masseria's group not just as rivals, but as an insult to their heritage. They were fighting for tradition. Their strength was their discipline. Their weakness was their rigidity. Maranzano demanded total obedience. He saw the world in black and white. You were either with him or against him. There was no middle ground. He wanted to be the capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses. It was a title straight out of the old country. It sounded grand, it sounded powerful, but it was a fantasy. America was too big, the rackets were too diverse. You couldn't rule it like a king from a throne. The younger generation, they understood this. Maranzano, for all his study of Caesar, he didn't understand the new republic he was trying to conquer. The mustache Petes were formidable fighters. They were ruthless. They were patient. They planned their moves carefully. They used spies. They used intimidation. They were fighting a holy war in their minds. A war to preserve the Sicilian way of life against the corrupting influence of America. They saw Masseria and his allies as undisciplined rabble. They underestimated the ambition brewing in their own ranks. They underestimated men like Luciano. They saw him as just another one of Masseria's thugs. They didn't see the gears turning in his head. They didn't see that he was playing a much longer game, a game they couldn't even comprehend. Now let's talk about the other side, the young guys, the guys who got it. At the top of that list was Charlie Luciano, Lucky, a name he earned. He wasn't Castellammarese, he wasn't Neapolitan, he was just a gangster, a smart one. He grew up on the Lower East Side. He was friends with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Jewish kids. To the mustache Pete's this was a sin, but to Luciano it was just business, good business. He saw the future. He saw that the real money wasn't in Sicilian squabbles, it was in organizing crime, all of it, Italian, Jewish, Irish, it didn't matter. The color that mattered was green. Luciano was officially with Joe the boss Masseria, but his loyalty was flexible. He saw Masseria for what he was, a greedy, sloppy old-world boss. Masseria was all about squeezing his own guys for more tribute. He was short-sighted, he was killing the golden goose. Luciano and his friends, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, they were different, they were businessmen. They wanted to build something that would last, something efficient. The war between Masseria and Maranzano, they saw it as a disaster. It was bad for business, it was drawing too much heat, it was a war between two old fools, and they were caught in the middle. This group, the Young Turks, they were playing chess while the old guys were playing checkers. They communicated. They formed alliances across family lines. Luciano was talking to everyone. He was talking to Frank Costello, the prime minister, who could smooth things over with politicians and judges. He was talking to Vito Genovese, a stone-cold killer. He was talking to Meyer Lansky, the brain, the financial genius. They understood that the old way of doing things, this endless cycle of vendetta and revenge, was a dead end. It was time for a new way, a corporate way, a national syndicate of crime. The pressure on Luciano was immense. Masseria demanded loyalty. He wanted Luciano to prove himself by killing his friends, like Tommy Reyna. Luciano was walking a tightrope. He had to play along with Masseria. He had to pretend he was a loyal soldier, but all the while he was planning, he was waiting. He saw that the war was a gift, an opportunity. It would weaken both sides. It would clear the board of the old kings. It would create a power vacuum, and when the time was right, he and his crew would be there to fill it. He wasn't fighting for Masseria. He wasn't fighting for Maranzano. He was fighting for himself, for the future. The first real move, the one that told everyone this wasn't just talk anymore. It happened in February 1930. The target was Gaetano Tom Reyna. He ran the Bronx. He was supposed to be a Masseria ally, but he was tired of Masseria's greed. He was secretly leaning towards Maranzano. Masseria found out. You don't betray the boss. So one evening as Reyna was leaving his mistress's apartment, a man stepped out of the shadows. A shotgun blast. It echoed through the Bronx. Reyna was dead. The message was clear. There is no neutrality, there is no switching sides, you are with us or you are in a coffin. The man who pulled the trigger was a young Vito Genovese, acting on orders from Luciano, who was acting on orders from Masseria. See the chain? Luciano had to prove his loyalty. He sacrificed Reyna, a friend, to stay in the game. It was a cold move, a necessary one. Masseria then installed his own man, Joseph Pinzolo, to run Reyna's family. This was a mistake. The Reyna family hated Pinzolo. They were loyal to their dead boss. They secretly defected to Maranzano, led by men like Gaetano Gagliano and Tommy Lucchese. The war was now official. The battle lines were drawn in blood. The war wasn't fought in the open, not at first. It was a war of spies and whispers, a war of ambushes in dark alleys. Maranzano's people, the Castellammarese, were masters of this. They would strike and then vanish. They hit one of Masseria's top lieutenants, Giuseppe Morello, the old fox. He was gunned down in his East Harlem office, a big blow to Masseria, a huge victory for Maranzano. Morello was one of the original Mustache Pete's, a pioneer. His death showed that no one was safe. The old respect, the old rules, they were gone. This was total war. The city was on edge. Every Italian-American man in a dark suit and a fedora was a potential target or a potential killer. Business owners paid tribute to both sides just to be safe. The police were overwhelmed. Or maybe they were just paid to look the other way. The violence escalated. Carloads of gunmen would screech through the streets, Tommy guns blazing. It was like something out of a movie. But the blood was real, the fear was real. For Luciano and the Young Turks it was a nightmare. The chaos was hurting the bottom line. It was time to bring it to an end. But how? You couldn't reason with men like Masseria and Maranzano. You had to eliminate them. Perfect. Section 5. The body count rises. A bloody stalemate. The war dragged on through 1930 and into 1931. The body count climbed. It was a war of attrition, each side trying to wear the other down. Maranzano's forces seemed to have the upper hand. They were more disciplined, more strategic. They picked off Masseria's key allies one by one. Joseph Pinzolo, the man Masseria had put in charge of the Reina crew, well, he was found dead. Shot 5 times. His body was left in a Times Square office building, a message from the Reina loyalists, now with Maranzano. The Bronx was lost to Masseria. His empire was crumbling. Masseria grew desperate. He became paranoid. He trusted no one. He holed himself up surrounded by loyal bodyguards. He demanded more and more money from his territories to fund the war. But his soldiers were losing faith. They saw the writing on the wall. Maranzano was winning. The smart guys, the guys with a future, they started looking for a way out. They looked to Luciano. He was still officially with Masseria, but everyone knew he was the one making moves. He was the one talking to the other side. He was the bridge between the old world and the new. He was waiting for his moment. The list of the dead is a who's who of the underworld at the time. Men whose names were whispered in fear. Alfredo Almineo Manfredi, a top Masseria enforcer, along with Steve Ferrigno. They were gunned down in the courtyard of a Bronx apartment building. They walked into a Maranzano ambush. It was a major blow. Masseria was losing his muscle. He was losing his territory. He was losing the war. He was like a wounded bear, cornered and dangerous. But his reign was coming to an end. And Luciano knew he had to be the one to deliver the final blow. If he didn't, Maranzano would win, and Luciano would be next on his list. The stalemate was brutal. It was a meat grinder. For every Maranzano man killed, 2 of Masseria's seemed to fall. The Castellammarese faction was smaller, but they fought smarter. They had allies across the country, from Buffalo to Detroit to Chicago. Masseria was isolated. He was a king in his castle, but the walls were closing in. The streets of New York ran with blood, and for what? For the pride of 2 old men. Luciano saw the waste, the stupidity of it all. He had to make a choice. Side with a losing boss or create his own destiny. For a guy named Lucky, it wasn't much of a choice at all. The end for Joe. The boss Masseria came at a restaurant. It always does, doesn't it? April 15, 1931. A place called Nuova Villa Tamaro on Coney Island. Luciano invited his boss to lunch, to talk strategy, to smooth things over. Masseria, maybe he was getting comfortable, maybe he thought Luciano was still his loyal dog. They ate, they drank, they played cards. It was a nice peaceful afternoon. Then, Luciano excused himself. He went to the men's room. That was the signal. The moment he was out of the room, the door swung open. 4 men walked in. Not Castellammarese soldiers. These were Luciano's guys, his secret weapon. Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel, a mix of Italian and Jewish killers. The future of organized crime. They opened fire. The place erupted in gunfire. Masseria was caught completely by surprise. He was hit again and again, 20 bullets. When the police arrived, they found him dead on the floor, lying in a pool of blood and scattered playing cards. The ace of spades, the death card, was clutched in his hand. A little bit of theater. Luciano, of course, knew nothing. He was in the bathroom. He didn't hear a thing. With Masseria gone, the war was over. Just like that. Luciano had delivered victory to Maranzano. He had betrayed his boss to end the bloodshed. Maranzano was thrilled. He called a huge meeting in the Bronx. Hundreds of gangsters from all over the country. He declared himself the capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses. He lectured them about honor and loyalty. He laid out his grand vision for the new American Mafia, a structure based on his beloved Roman Empire. He reorganized the New York families. He made Luciano a boss. He made Galliano a boss. He rewarded his allies. He thought he had won. He thought he was Caesar. But Luciano was playing a different game. He saw Maranzano for what he was, another mustache Pete, another greedy, power-hungry tyrant, just like Masseria. Maranzano was already making lists of people he didn't trust, people who needed to be eliminated. And guess whose name was at the top of that list? Lucky Luciano, and his non-Sicilian friends, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Maranzano had won the war, but he hadn't learned its lesson. He didn't understand that the era of the single, all-powerful boss was over. Luciano knew he had only traded one tyrant for another, and this one had to go too. The revolution wasn't over, it had just begun. Salvatore Maranzano enjoyed his reign for about 6 months. He thought he was the new emperor of crime. He set up his office in a grand suite on Park Avenue. He demanded that all the other bosses come and pay him tribute, kiss his ring. He was arrogant. He was drunk with power, and he made the same mistake Mafia did. He underestimated Luciano. He saw Luciano as a useful tool, a soldier who had done his job. He didn't see him as an equal. He didn't see him as a threat. He was a Roman scholar, but he forgot a key lesson from his history books. Even Caesar had a Brutus. Luciano knew he was a marked man. Maranzano had hired an Irish killer, Mad Dog Call, to take him out. Time was running out, so Luciano and Meyer Lansky planned one last brilliant move. They couldn't use Italian gunmen. Maranzano's people would recognize them, so Lansky reached out to his own crew, a team of Jewish assassins. Men Maranzano would never suspect. They disguised themselves as police officers and tax agents. They had phony badges, phony credentials. They were going to raid the emperor in his own palace. It was audacious. It was brilliant. It was the future. September 10th, 1931. The day the empire fell, the 4 Jewish gunmen led by the legendary Samuel Red Levine walked into Maranzano's Park Avenue office. They disarmed the bodyguards. They walked right into the boss's private room. Maranzano thought they were cops. He was ready to talk his way out of it, but then they pulled their knives and their guns. They stabbed him multiple times before shooting him. It was a brutal, efficient execution. To make sure the job was done, Tommy Lucchese, who was in on the plot, was waiting outside. He confirmed Maranzano was dead. The boss of all bosses was no more. On that same day, across the country, other gangsters loyal to Maranzano were eliminated. It was a coordinated strike, a purge. Some people call it the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, though that's probably an exaggeration. But the message was undeniable. The old guard was finished. The mustache Petes were swept away in a single bloody tide. The war was finally truly over. There was no king left on the board. The throne was empty. The path was clear for a new order. An order conceived not by a Sicilian traditionalist but by a modern corporate gangster. An order conceived by Lucky Luciano. With both Mafia and Maranzano in the ground, there was a power vacuum. Chaos could have erupted again. A dozen different bosses could have started a new war, fighting to be the next boss of all bosses. But Luciano had a different idea. He had seen the cost of that kind of ambition. It was bad for business. It was bad for everyone. He didn't want to be a king. He wanted to be a chairman of the board. He wanted to create something that would last. Something that would prevent these bloody wars from ever happening again. He wanted to create the commission. The idea was simple, revolutionary, for the Mafia. Instead of one man ruling over everyone, a board of directors would run things. The bosses of the most powerful families would sit on this board, the 5 families of New York Luciano's family, Bonanos, Gaglianos, the Mangano family, and the Profaci family. And they would be joined by the boss of the Chicago outfit, Al Capone, and the boss from Buffalo, Stefano Magaddino. 7 men. They would meet. They would vote, they would settle disputes, they would approve new bosses, they would sanction hits, no more wars, just business. This was a truly American idea. It was a corporation, it was a Congress. It replaced the sword with the gavel. The commission's rules were straightforward. No boss could be killed without the commission's approval. All disputes between families would be brought before the board for mediation. Territories would be respected. It was a national crime syndicate, organized and efficient. It allowed them to cooperate on a massive scale. They could pool their resources, their political connections, their muscle. They could control unions, rackets, and industries from coast to coast. It was the birth of the modern American Mafia. Luciano was the first among equals. He was the chairman. But he wasn't a dictator. His power came from his intelligence, his ability to build consensus. He had the respect of the other bosses because he had ended the war and made everyone richer and safer. He had brought his Jewish associates, Lansky and Siegel, into the fold as trusted partners. He had created a multi-ethnic, national network of crime. It was the biggest consequence of the Castellammarese War, the destruction of the old feudal system and the creation of a new corporate one, an empire built not on one man's ego but on a foundation of shared greed. The Castellammarese War lasted less than 2 years, but its impact is still felt today. It was the Mafia's bloody coming of age. It was the moment it shed its old-world skin and became a truly American institution. The list of the dead is long. Gaetano Reina, Giuseppe Morello, Joseph Pinzolo, Almaneo Manfredi, Steve Ferrigno, Joe Masseria, Salvatore Maranzano. These were the kings and princes of the old order. Their deaths were the price of progress, a brutal, bloody price. But for the men who survived, it paid off. Big time. The war's greatest consequence was the organization it created, the Commission. For decades, it kept the peace, mostly. It allowed the Mafia to flourish in the shadows, to grow into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. It became more sophisticated, it moved into legitimate businesses, it corrupted politicians, judges, and union leaders. All of this was possible because of the structure Luciano put in place. The war forced the mob to evolve, to adapt or die. The Mustache Petes, with their obsession with honor and tradition, they died. The Young Turks, with their focus on business and organization, they adapted, and they thrived. This story, it's about more than just gangsters with funny names. It's about power. It's about change. It's about the clash between the old and the new. It's a classic American story in a twisted way. A story of immigrants who built an empire. They just built it on the wrong side of the law. Luciano's vision was a dark reflection of the American dream. He wanted to create a more perfect union for criminals. He wanted to establish justice for gangsters. He wanted to ensure domestic tranquility among mobsters, and for a while, he did. The ghosts of the Castellammarese War still haunt the streets of New York, the echoes of the shotgun blasts and the Tommy guns. It was a turning point, a moment of terrible violence that gave birth to a new kind of order, an order that would define organized crime for the rest of the 20th century. It proves a dark truth. Sometimes the only way to build something new is to burn the old world to the ground. That's the legacy of the Castellammarese War, a legacy written in blood, forged in betrayal, and built to last. It's a hell of a story. You couldn't make it up.